The government shutdown is causing some deals to bust, and I've had this issue come up a few times recently about what happens when the deal busts because of a government shutdown, and now the buyer may not be able to get a loan. What happens with things like their earnest money? Well, let's take a look at this because this is only happening with a few different types of loans. And really primarily what we're looking at are USDA loans. And here's the deal. USDA loan is something that is not uncommon here in Oklahoma, and no new USDA loans are being issued right now. The Department of Agriculture specifically said that even loans that were already approved, once the government shut down, they are not actually sending the funds. They're not funding them. Any new applications or pending applications are not being approved. And so we have some potential problems. And now there's other issues with this government shutdown, like flood insurance. And, this might even start to impact things like FHA and VA loans when you're dealing with government entities that have to have a step in the process. But the problem right now we're seeing are USDA loans. And I've talked to multiple people who have had deals bust because of USDA loans. And one of the questions that came up is what happens with their earnest money in this case, right? Is this something that the buyer would be entitled to a refund of their earnest money, or would the seller be entitled to keep the buyer's earnest money because it would be like a breach of contract? And so I thought, since I've run into this a few times, I wanted to share my perspective on it and why I think that the buyer should be entitled to a refund of their earnest money. If the deal busts, they can't get financing because they can't get a USDA loan. Now, we know that in the base residential contract, we have, this issue if a buyer can't provide funding. And we look at that in paragraph 16. So let's take a look here real quick, just to look at kind of the general rule first. So if a buyer is unable to provide funding, so it starts down here in the breach of contract, paragraph 16b. So the sellers perform their obligation and the buyer fails to provide funding, then the seller can do things like cancel, retain all sums paid by the buyer, so they can keep the earnest money, that kind of thing. But I don't think that's necessarily applicable in most cases, because we should, if we're getting a USDA loan, have a USDA housing loan supplement. And now all of our addenda are the same. So if this happened because of a VA loan wasn't able to fund because of the government shutdown, then it's going to work basically the same way, because all these addenda say the same thing. Now, it starts out in paragraph 1, and it says here that the contract is contingent on the buyer getting a USDA loan in the certain amount, whatever they put in here. This is where it kicks in. If the buyer is unable to secure financing and provides notice to the seller within the time period in the closing paragraph of the contract, then the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer, subject to appropriate written authorization of the parties. So how does this work in practice, or how should this be working? Well, look, the question is, first of all, is the buyer unable to secure financing? Right? That's the thing. If the buyer's unable to secure financing, so are they? Yes. And does it say why? It doesn't say why they are unable to secure financing. It just says, look, if they can't get it. It doesn't say they don't qualify. It's not that, well, my credit report changed or I lost my job. It just says if the buyer's unable to secure financing. And so is that the case here? Yes. The buyer is unable to secure financing because the government has shut down, and the financing that they wanted to get, that they put into the contract, is no longer available to them by the closing date. And that's the next piece, is that it says, look, if that's the case, then if the buyer provides notice to the seller within the time period in the closing funding and possession paragraph. So step 2 here is, if we are unable to secure financing because that USDA loan is no longer available, and then the buyer provides notice to the seller, they say, look, I'm unable to secure financing because the government shut down, can't get my USDA loan. And I do that before the closing date in the paragraph. Back in paragraph 3 of the contract, closing is on this date or before. And so if we've provided that notice, then what happens? Well, the contract tells us, right? It says right here that the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer, subject to appropriate written authorization, which means that the party should sign a disbursement of earnest money because the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. Real estate is complicated. There are so many moving parts to a real estate deal, to the contract, to the compliance, and sometimes you need a little bit of help along the way. That's why we started our Pro Access, which is a community of over 120 real estate professionals who have a great community to ask questions, to get answers, including answers from people like me who can help you with your contract issues, your compliance questions. It's just a supportive group that helps get us along the way. But on top of that, we do 3 monthly live sessions where we get people together to cover different topics. Like, for example, our skill builder that we just did, covering the MLS's new delayed marketing status and how you can get your listings banned from Zillow if you don't handle things correctly, and how those things all play together, because we want to make sure you don't get banned from Zillow. So we just did a live session. One of our 3 live sessions this month was on that. Plus, we offer tons of resources like our policies and procedures template library. Whether you are an agent or a broker or whoever, we are here to help you at our Pro Access. So check that out at ourproaccess.com. And this is how all of our addenda work. If the buyer is unable to secure financing, and it doesn't necessarily even say why. So in this case, like, is the government being shut down and they won't give the money? Is that unable to secure financing? Yeah, it is. And then if the buyer then goes and provides notice to the seller within that time period in the contract before closing, right? So even though we may be a day or two before closing or the day of closing and we find out, look, government shutdown, we're not gonna be able to get financing because of it, and we provide notice to the seller, then what happens? The earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer, subject to appropriate written authorizations. So should the seller go ahead and sign that disbursement of earnest money? Yeah, they should. And I know that's not fun. Nobody wants a deal to bust, but we do have to handle it correctly, right? We have to make sure we know how that works so that, one, the seller can move on if that's the case and get that house listed and sold to somebody else, and that buyer can get that refund of the earnest money that they really are entitled to. Right? And so make sure you know how to handle this particular situation as we look at this government shutdown that's currently ongoing, that could continue on for who knows? I mean, I was listening to a podcast yesterday and they were saying maybe Thanksgiving, maybe end of the year, but nobody has a crystal ball. So who knows? But while this is going on, we may see some deals bust because of things like, for example, USDA not issuing loans could potentially at some point impact maybe an FHA or VA loan. We don't know. Could impact flood insurance availability. We don't know. And so those kinds of things could interfere. But remember, at the end of the day, what does the loan addenda say? It says if the buyer is unable to secure financing, they give notice to the seller within that closing time period, then they shall get their earnest money back. So please make sure your buyers and your sellers understand that. Please make sure you understand that. And let's do the best we can in even a bad situation. So hopefully this government shutdown will be resolved and we'll be able to get these real estate deals back on the track. But in the meantime, now you know a little bit more about what's happening with this shutdown and how it's impacting some deals. Good luck out there. Hope you keep your deals together.